And then what happens when you go looking for a big solution? You never find it, right? There you are looking for the magic bullet that's going to transform your mind. And then you'll be a disciplined person and you will be like one of those people. It'll be a personality transformation. And this is why people stay stuck. So you have to experiment. Not all big problems require big solutions. I've noticed that there are a lot of people in this community who have sort of these cycles of like boom and bust when it comes to motivation. So there's a lot of people, myself included, who like, you'll wake up one day and something weird will happen and you'll be like highly motivated. And then you try to, you work really hard and then there's like this thought in the back of your mind, like, oh my God, like when is this going to end? I know it's going to end. And then you're like motivated for a week and then like it falls apart. And then you're kind of like, you let things kind of fail and you don't follow up with stuff and things like that. And then you're kind of like, you got a week or two of like, you're in a gray zone where you're like, not really feeling it. And then you feel ashamed of yourself and all this kind of stuff. And then eventually like you wake up and your motivation comes back and then like, then you kind of go back to it. So there's almost this cycle of success and failure. And if we want to understand the cycle of success and failure, we have to take a slightly different perspective on motivation that I think actually Western science is sort of missing out a little bit on. And not to say that it misses out on it entirely, but if we kind of look at Western perspectives on motivation, right? So for example, we have a very strongly supported model of personality called the 5-factor model. And the 5-factor model has this attribute called conscientiousness. And what conscientiousness is essentially like your ability to like complete tasks over a period of time. So if you look at median income and worldly success, it's correlated with high conscientiousness. So the people who have a personality trait of high conscientiousness are people that we call like disciplined, right? And those are the people that like are lucky because their personality is more oriented towards being conscientious and disciplined and organized. And they're the ones who can wake up at 7 a.m. every day and exercise before they go to work, and they apply to promotions on time, and they like, keep their resumes up to date, and like they're very consistent and conscientious, focused. And so in the West, we sort of think about, and we can even see it in our language. So the way that our science is sort of structured is to sort of look at motivation or discipline or conscientiousness as a trait, right? It's an aspect of who you are. It's part of your personality. And while personality can certainly change over time, it's not like a temporary thing. So the word trait refers to something that is like kind of a permanent part of you. And then there are also states. So a state is something that is inherently fluctuating. So for example, states of consciousness. There's like being conscious. There's being asleep. There's like fever is another example of a state, right? Being sick is a state. It's not a trait. It's not a part of who you are. It's something that fluctuates within you. And when I hear people talk about motivation, I've sort of noticed that there's a bias of talking about it like a trait, right? So there's two types of people. There's lazy people and there are disciplined people. There are unmotivated people and there are motivated people. So this is sort of like trait-like dialogue. And our science sort of supports this kind of hypothesis or bias, right? Where we sort of like have 5-factor analysis and we sort of like look at that and we say, okay, like there is actually like a conscientiousness trait to your personality, and it's kind of inborn and it's relatively constant. So it sort of makes sense. It's scientific that, people are disciplined and people are lazy. But if you really look at it, right, if you look at it very carefully, what you really discover in your own life is that motivation is actually a temporary thing. By nature, your motivation fluctuates over time, right? So like, just like we said, the whole problem is that our motivation fluctuates over time. And then we kind of get into a problem because, if we acknowledge that our motivation fluctuates over time, like that it's essentially a state, right? So I'm highly motivated today. I'm not motivated tomorrow. Then, it's kind of tricky because like if our solutions are sort of trait-based, if they're personality-based, and people sort of try to figure out how can I become a disciplined person, that's where our target is. What we really try to do is become something that we're not. So we want to like flip a switch that turns on our motivation, like almost permanently, right? I want to become a motivated person. And that's what I sort of gear towards. That's what like success gurus will sort of talk about, right? Like this is how you become a motivated person. But it's all very trait-based thinking. And it's kind of interesting because, in the East, they sort of think about motivation a little bit more like a state. So this is also, a generalization. But if you look at yogis, for example, what they'll say is like, the nature of the mind is that it fluctuates and that like motivation will naturally fluctuate over time. In fact, the definition of yoga, so there's a Sanskrit, line, yoga chitta vritta nirodha, which means that yoga is the cessation of fluctuations of the mind. That is literally the definition of yoga. And so what does that kind of mean? Like, so how is it that yoga and meditation and yogis are like, they're like pretty hardcore, right? Like they wake up at like 4 a.m. every day and they like meditate and do yoga and they're very careful about their diet and things like that. And so it's kind of interesting because like, how does that, what they kind of focus on is not becoming disciplined. What they focus on is controlling the state of their mind and acknowledge that by definition, it's actually fluctuating. Okay? So I want you all to think about something. So what I'd like to share with you all today is an understanding of motivation as a state instead of a trait. So I want you to think about something. So if I play video games every day, let's say I wake up every day and I spend all my time watching Twitch and video games and YouTube and Netflix and whatnot, okay? So when I look at myself, I say to myself, I am unmotivated. And that is why I spend all my time playing video games and Netflix and whatever, right? So I want y'all to think about this for a second. Is it because you are unmotivated that you spend all your time, you waste your time, right? They say, oh, if I was more motivated, I wouldn't, like if I was motivated, I would go out and like get a job or exercise or whatever, if I was motivated. So, if I was motivated, then I would spend all my time doing this stuff. But I want you guys to think, what's the chicken and what's the egg? Is the lack of motivation what causes you to play video games all day? Or is it playing video games all day that causes the lack of motivation? And so there's a really simple experiment for this, right? So like you think about, your motivational level. Let's say like you want to work on your resume. When you wake up first thing in the morning on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you want to work on your resume? Let's call it a 4. Okay? Let's say like you're not even work on it. But if you measure your motivational level, it's like a 4 out of 10. And then like after you play like an hour of a game, what happens to your motivation? Are you like more motivated or less motivated to work on your resume? And then like after 6 hours of a game and 8 hours of a game, like if you've been playing League for 10 hours, how motivated are you to work on things? Right? And so it's interesting because most people are saying less, some people are saying more, so we'll get to that in a second. Some people are saying the same. But I'm not saying that, even without doing the behavior, your motivation towards the behavior will fluctuate. I know it's kind of interesting, right? But if you really pay attention to yourself, we're not saying that if you say the same because you're not doing it, that's not actually correct. Your motivation actually fluctuates, which is a really fascinating discovery because then what we sort of realize is that like playing video games induces low motivation, which is a really shocking discovery because that doesn't mean that you're lazy or disciplined, right? It's not a trait. It's that the things that you do will actively contribute or not contribute to your motivation. So essentially what the yogis sort of discovered is a system where I would kind of think about it this way. There are certain actions. So I want you to think about motivation not as like a personality characteristic or like a stat on your character sheet. It's not like there are disciplined people and undisciplined people. I want you to think about motivation as a bank balance. And there's some actions that you take which will contribute to the balance. And then when you want to do something, you will actually like pull from the balance, right? I'm going to make deposits and I'm going to make withdrawals. So if I know it sounds kind of weird, going to the gym requires a withdrawal, right? But being at the gym actually makes a deposit, which is interesting. So now we begin to see like how disciplined people are able to do it because every time they go to the gym, they make a withdrawal, but they also make a deposit. And y'all, it's kind of like really fascinating because if you notice yourselves and the cycle of motivation, what essentially happens is like you do something, right? And then you feel motivated. And you're like, okay, I cleaned my room. Good. Now I'm going to do this, and now I'm going to do this, and now I'm going to do this, and now I'm going to do this. And if we spend all of our time playing video games, like what's happening to our motivation? Like we're making withdrawals from it, right? Like if I'm decreasing my motivational capital when I waste my days. And so it's kind of interesting because then if we look at the cycle of motivation, inevitably what we find is as people become more motivated and they start doing more stuff, they start engaging in actions which require withdrawals, but they're not making the appropriate deposits. I know it sounds kind of weird, But if I start like, if I clean my room, that requires an energy investment and gives me a burst of energy. And then eventually what I'll end up doing is I'll take on like bigger tasks, more difficult tasks, like more challenging tasks that actually withdraw more of my motivational energy than I'm able to deposit. So a good example of this is like tackling finding a job, right? Because like that task is so big that you don't really get the reward until the end, but there are all of these steps involved, which you may actually be making motivational withdrawals for, and then you kind of like run out of motivation. And I know it sounds like really, really weird, but if you look at people who go into cycles of success and failure, what they essentially do is like they start off lighting the candle, and then they like light a firecracker, and then like they light like, they just like burn all their motivation away, and then it's like a set of fireworks, and then they feel completely spent afterward. And what I really find is that if you really want to sustain your motivation, you have to continually make deposits. So we see this in addictions too, okay? So addictions is a fantastic example of this, where, someone is like, yeah, like I'm 1 week sober. Hell yeah. Like, how did you get 1 week sober? I went to 3 meetings a week. And then they're like, I'm sober. It's great. I feel awesome. I'm going to start doing this. I'm going to start doing this because I'm sober now. I'm sober now. And eventually what happens is like, oh, like, what about going to meetings? Oh, I don't need to go to meetings anymore. Like, I'm sober. I don't need meetings. I've done it. I'm 3 months sober. So they stopped going to meetings, right? And at first they were like super careful. And they like went to their first barbecue where people were drinking and they were going to meetings at the time. They're like, oh, I can handle this now. So they stopped going to meetings and they continue going to barbecues. And then eventually what happens, they continue going to barbecues and then they relapse. And so like, how did that relapse happen? I thought you had it under control. Like I thought you had solved it. And they're like, yeah, now I am sober. It becomes a trait in their mind instead of a state. It's no longer something that I have to work towards. I have it on lock. I am sober now. I am disciplined. I don't need to worry about maintaining discipline because I am disciplined. And so essentially what we discover is that there are contributing factors to our motivation, which is it's a state, right? So you've got these motivational bucks, and it's going to fluctuate over time. And instead of chasing after becoming a disciplined person, all you really need to do is like keep on making motivational deposits. In the case of sobriety, what it means is like you go to meetings, even if you're sober, you keep going to meetings. Because I see this all the time, in mental health treatment especially, is that people love abandoning the treatment that works. Like if I put someone on an antidepressant medication and 6 months later, they're no longer depressed. They come into my office and they're like, yeah, I want to stop the medication. Why? Because I'm not depressed anymore. It's a reasonable like request, right? But like, let's understand how you got there. And so if you're experiencing cycles of success and failure, what I really want y'all to pay attention to is what is like the state of motivation what led to your state of motivation. So like really think a little bit about, when people say like, oh, okay, like I shouldn't play video games. I need to stop playing video games entirely. Whereas recognize that each hour of the day that you play video games, it actually makes like a motivational withdrawal. So, and this is really dangerous thinking because if I play like, let's say Valorant for 10 hours a day or Dota for 10 hours a day, and I think to myself, if I play for 8 hours a day, what difference does it make? 8 or 10, what's the difference? I'm not going to put together my life if I'm playing Dota for 8 hours a day. Who the hell cares about 10 hours a day? Like 8 or 10, what difference does it make? I'm a degenerate either way. And those are the people that don't acknowledge that playing Dota for 2 less hours a day is actually going to boost your motivation by a small amount. So I want y'all to really focus on the state of motivation. And you can also kind of understand this with food as well, right? So like you can think about when you eat, like how much do you feel like studying? How much do you feel like working? And like depending on what food you put into your body, how does that affect your motivation? If I'm like, if noon rolls around and I eat like 6 slices of pepperoni pizza, like what's going to happen to my motivation afterward? What happens to my motivation when I drink coffee? What happens to my motivation when I take Adderall? So we begin to see that once again, and this is why yogis have a very specific diet, because they sort of discovered something called the sattvic diet. What the sattvic diet essentially does is like enhances the state of your mind so that you're like highly motivated. And so it's kind of tricky because like, we think about discipline and laziness, but what we really don't think about is like, what is the cost of eating 6 slices of pizza? It's not just calories. And you're like, I'm a degenerate. I don't care about calories. Like, whatever. Like, I'm overweight, whatever. Or you're not overweight. Maybe you've got a Vata metabolism and you're totally fine. But what we don't really think about is each action that you take is going to be making a motivational deposit or a motivational withdrawal. And what I encourage y'all to do is to really think about the state of motivation and think about how does my motivation get altered and how do I need to nurture it? Because it's not a trait, right? It's not like a house that I build and then stays up there. Motivation needs to be cultivated like a garden. Now, I can water it every day and it'll grow and it'll be great. But if I stop watering it, the garden's going to die. So most people that I work with who have cycles of success or failure, essentially, once they start harvesting fruit or vegetables or herbs or whatever from their garden, they stop taking care of it, which inevitably leads to the failure. So start to think a little bit more about motivation as a state and start to think a little bit about how your diet, how your actions, how the company that you keep, how your environment sort of gives you motivational deposits. And be really careful if you start to withdraw a ton without continuing to maintain whatever brought you the motivation in the first place. How do I get enough protein with a sattvic diet? It's tough, but remember that the sattvic diet, you can eat tofu and you can eat lentils, right? So those are the two major sources of protein. But if you're going to be a bodybuilder and you're trying to eat 1 gram of protein per kg, I think is what it is, that's really hard to do on the sattvic diet. Remember that sattvic people are not bodybuilders. What about discipline? So here's what I'd say about discipline. Discipline is what a high state of motivation looks like from the outside. So if you actually look inside the mind of a disciplined person, they're not disciplined. Like, it's not very different from your mind. It's just, I know it sounds kind of weird, but discipline is like what we see from the outside. It's an emergent property. It's not actually a thing. Yeah, so can you provide some practical examples of depositing and withdrawing stuff from your motivational bank? Absolutely. So like I have, right? So like playing a video game, what does that do to your motivational bank? Decreases it. Or you're not making a deposit, right? So like if you think about doing a small task like cleaning is going to be a motivational deposit and a motivational cost. But generally speaking, it's going to be an upswing. So if we think about cleaning, this is the way I'd think about cleaning. So cleaning withdraws 5 motivational points, but gives you a +2 for the next week, every single day. Right? So what we tend to see is that people who are highly disciplined, will do multiple things. Going to the gym is a -10, but is a +4 for the next week. Eating a healthy meal, maybe like a -2, but will be a +1 for a +3 for the next 3 days. Right? So this is how I want you guys to think about your motivational bank. It's like, what is the small task every time I play a video game? Like if I play 1 day of Dota, that's a -2 for the next 72 hours. Right? And then eventually we get to like dopamine detox realm, where if you play that so much, then it's like a pretty bad -30% or -50% to all motivational deposits. It's a 50% tax on every deposit that you make. So this is why if you look at people who put their lives together, they do so not by transforming themselves, right? And even this is the problem is if you look at people who become successful, and I fall into this camp, right? I say, I went to India and I found myself and then I became successful. And it seems like a magical overnight thing. But I went to India at the age of 21 and I started medical school at the age of 28. There's 7 years in there of little successes and little failures that sort of build up over time. So it took me 7 years to get on the path to success, let alone another 8 to actually become qualified to be a decent human being. Is a sattvic diet going to be vegan? No. So sattvic diets will include dairy. Actually, unless you do the East Asian version of a sattvic diet, which may be dairy-free. Those will probably be vegan. If you eat at, a monastery in Korea, that'll probably be vegan. How does one overcome more difficult obstacles to gain motivation? Is it just do it? No. So this is my whole point. So the way that you overcome a difficult obstacle is by making tiny, tiny deposits that are going to build up your motivational bank. Right? So how do you overcome depression? I've seen a bunch of these posts recently where people are I cleaned my kitchen today. Does that overcome depression? No. Is it a step forward? Absolutely. So you clean your kitchen one day, you do your laundry day 2, you like clean the living room day 3, and you go through your mail day 4. You look at your syllabus day 5, and each of those days is going to give you like a motivation buff that's like stacking. And then what happens is people stack it, and then they get to the point they're like, oh, look at all this motivation I have. Now comes the cycle of success and failure, because you've stacked up a buff of plus 28 motivation per day that starts decaying over time, and then you stop doing the things to take care of yourself. And then it all disappears, right? So I want you all to stop thinking about discipline or saying like, oh, I took a 5-factor personality test and my conscientiousness is low. I'm screwed. Like, that's scientifically, that's true. And you can still overcome it, right? By using motivation buffs, which is the Eastern style. So if people want one really, really simple, concrete thing to do to make a motivational deposit, one day a week, okay? Like if you have medical concerns or something like that, like make sure you talk to your doctor. But I'd say one day a week, do a fast that includes fruits, nuts, and dairy, and that's it. One day a week. And water, obviously. So like drink as much water as you want to. But, you know, you can still get a decent number of calories. So we're not saying like starve yourself, but like reduce what kind of macronutrients you take in. Fruits, nuts, and dairy. That's it. Yeah, so if you've got like diabetes and stuff, you know, don't do this kind of thing. But how does this help? It's going to give you a motivational buff of like +3 for the next few days. That's how it's going to help. No veggies. Just give it a shot. So I'm not saying you should do it for a prolonged period of time. You try it for a day and see if you like it. So a lot of people, I encourage all of y'all to experiment with your diet, right? Try to figure out, okay, what are the foods that make me feel more motivated? What are the foods that make me feel less motivated? Start to make adjustments. And I think a good place to start is like, you know, you'll get some amount of protein, some amount of fat, and some amount of carbohydrate. It's a relatively safe thing to do. And if it feels really bad or you start to get concerned or whatever, like if you start to feel super weird, like just eat normally and you should be fine, or go see a doctor. Maybe ask your doctor before you do it. It's probably good advice. And so I want y'all to all pay attention to what's happening right now. So in your life, motivation is a big problem. Therefore, it requires a big solution. So the other problem with cycles of motivation and failure is that like, see how your mind resists the solution. It's like, oh, that can't be enough, because the problem feels so big to me that it must have a big solution. And then what happens when you go looking for a big solution? You never find it, right? There you are looking for the magic bullet that's going to transform your mind. And then you'll be a disciplined person and you will be like one of those people. It'll be a personality transformation. And this is why people stay stuck. So you have to experiment. Not all big problems require big solutions. Like someone has been addicted to alcohol for 15 years. How do I get sober? It's such a huge problem. You go to meetings. You go see a therapist. That's it. It's like 4 hours a week, 3 hours a week, 2 hours a week, maybe even 1 hour a week. It's really interesting. So be careful when your mind tells you that a solution is too simple or too easy for your hard and complex problem. And what you really I encourage you to think about it in your own life, right? Like when you realize something, you're like, oh crap, it's so simple. I just didn't realize it. Right? So big solutions don't necessarily require big problems. I mean, big problems don't necessarily require big solutions. Is vitamin D deficiency messing with motivation too? Absolutely. So there's, one of the tests that I always run, not always, but usually run for patients of mine who are depressed is vitamin D. So vitamin D deficiency is one of the causes for depression. And so we also know that, supplementing vitamin D or getting someone's vitamin D level back to normal can be a treatment for depression. So this is where in the East, they sort of say that there's 7 things that result in health. And one of them is sunlight. And that sunlight is like important to be healthy. What are the others? Okay, so let me see if I can remember them. Sunlight, food, water, air, sleep, exercise, and meditation. These are the 7 things that you should do to take care of yourself.